Thanks for the very warm welcome to Stockholm. I have a long-standing personal connection with Sweden, so it's wonderful to be here again. I'd like to talk to you today about the role of China and its impact on global fisheries and marine ecosystems. And I'd like to structure the presentation so that we'll examine China's impacts from three different perspectives. The first being distant water fishing. As many of you know, China's coastal waters are heavily overexploited, so this leads them to direct their fishing efforts outward. Also, China has a major fish processing industry. That'll be the second point that I touch on. And then finally, the changing patterns in consumption in China and how that might impact both fisheries and the fish that we buy in our own markets. So for each of these three topics, you'll see these icons along the right-hand side shown at the top of each slide, so you'll be able to follow along which topic I'm on. And for each one, I'd like to describe the scale and the trends, and also talk about what we see when we look to the future in each of these areas, and also how we might influence China to take a more sustainable approach. So the first topic is China's distant water fishing. When we think about and look at Chinese fishing or fisheries statistics, the first thing we need to keep in mind is that much of what we're looking at when we see these huge numbers is aquaculture. In fact, over 80% of what China quotes as its fisheries production is actually coming from aquaculture. So please keep that in mind when we look at the first slide, which shows the marine fish production from China over the last 30 years. From 1980 to 1990, things doubled, and then they doubled again up until the year 2000. After 2000, there wasn't much of an increase in marine capture production, and this may be because of the overexploitation that I mentioned in China's coastal fisheries. Around that time, i.e. in the last decade, China started really focusing on what they call the Zou Chu Chu policy, which is literally translated as to go out, but I like to translate it as the go global policy, or kind of has the feel in Chinese, go out and get it. This is not only a policy that's being implemented for fisheries, but also for many natural resources, as many of you will know, for forest products, for minerals, etc. So China's increasingly turning its attention to more distant waters, but in fact, what we see is that the distant water production is still a very small part of China's marine production. It's only 12%, and the production for 2010, which is the only year that I have the figure for, is just over 1 million tons. So it's 12% of the total marine production of China, and only 2% of the total aquatic products production in China, or water products, as they say in Chinese. So this gives you some indication that regulating and managing the distant water fisheries is probably not very much of a priority for the Chinese government, since it is such a small proportion of their total production. And another reason why distant water fishing is not really a focus for regulatory officials is that they have a very strict definition of what they call distant water fishing. We'll explore this more in the next few slides, but just to give you a preview, only those vessels that are flagged to China are counted in these statistics, and only those vessels which are fishing beyond China's adjacent seas. And I use that term very specifically because a lot of countries will talk about fishing within the exclusive economic zone and outside the EEZ, but China has a special definition for that, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. First, we need to think about what is the size of the distant water fishing fleet. Now, the FAO estimates that China has about 10% of the world's motorized fishing vessels, which is about 200,000 fishing vessels. Now, that's all of the vessels flagged to China, whether they're fishing close to shore, farther offshore, or in distant waters way across the globe. But of course, most of these are going to be coastal vessels. I tried in a study that I did for the British government a couple of years ago to actually find out how many distant water fishing vessels there are. And I was coming up with a lot of very different numbers. Some sources suggested there were as many as 17,000, whereas other sources suggested distant water fishing vessels in particular were somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000. And the clue to resolving this discrepancy lies in the definition of near sea versus distant waters. As I mentioned, the EEZ is not really a concept that's used very strictly in China because China has territorial disputes with a lot of its neighbors. So there are many fishing vessels, probably around 15,000, that are fishing in those disputed waters between China and Korea, between China and Japan, between China and Vietnam. And those that are fishing way offshore in other countries or offshore of other countries are probably only around 1,600. Nevertheless, the work of a researcher named Tabitha Mallory, and I specifically want to mention her because she's doing her PhD on this subject, has indicated that this is the largest distant water fleet in the world. And of course, as my research has shown, and I'll be indicating this in a few minutes, there are many other Chinese fishing vessels owned by Chinese, crewed by Chinese, that are fishing under other flags all around the world. So if we include those fishing vessels, we're going to get way, way above the numbers shown here. And Tabitha, if I could mention that again, is going to be completing her PhD at Johns Hopkins University later this year. And those of us who are interested in this topic will be really eager to see some publications coming out from that in the next year or so. Now, if there's uncertainty about the number of fishing vessels that China has, of course there's going to be uncertainty about what they're catching. So we know that it's underreported. We really don't know how much. And there are a number of reasons why we're so uncertain about this. First of all, as I mentioned, China only counts as distant water fishing production those vessels that are flagged to China. Furthermore, even if they're flagged to China, but they're not landing the fish in China, they're probably not counted in the Chinese distant water fishing production statistics. And even beyond that, if they are flagged to China and land in China, there may be problems with the data transmittal between the provinces and the central government, like countries around the world. Not all of these systems work well together, so there may be fish that are landed that are never reported. But according to the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture, Bureau of Fisheries, in 2010, there was that figure that you'll have seen from the previous slide, 1.16 million tons. However, a recent study by the University of British Columbia for the European Commission, which looked specifically at China's distant water fishing activities, suggested that there might be as much as 4.6 million tons caught per year. And the FAO from several years ago estimated, I'm not sure on what basis, 2.4 million tons. So we have some idea of the range that this catch might comprise, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. And to consider where China's fishing, obviously many, many places around the world, and a lot of them we don't know about because the boats are actually flagged to other countries. But the official sources suggest that in 2010 there were 35 countries, and I've shown those in red on, oh, sorry, the official total is 35. What I've shown in red on the map is what I was able to uncover in my research back in 2008, 37 countries. A lot in Africa, of course, many in Southeast Asia, and some in South America. In addition to these Chinese fishing activities in the EEZs of those countries, they're also fishing in the high seas. So China's involved in the tuna regional fisheries management organizations, as well as fishing for krill off Antarctica. So I'd like to now talk about two particular cases of China's distant water fishing activities around the world, both of which are quite controversial at the moment. The first one involves an agreement between a Chinese private company called Polyhondong Fishing Company, between that company and the government of Mauritania. This is a very active ecosystem off the west coast of Africa, a lot of fishing for small pelagics there. And this company was able to buy a 25-year access right to fish up to 100,000 tons per year. And of course, on the slide, I'm summarizing by saying small pelagics, but that's all it says in the agreement. It doesn't specify which fish they're allowed to catch and which they're not. In exchange for that access, China has agreed to invest $100 million in vessels, plants, and training, and most importantly, the creation of over 2,000 new local jobs in both fishing and processing. Now, in comparison, the EU has an agreement, or I think it still has an active agreement with Mauritania under its Fisheries Partnership Program, which was negotiated in 2006. And the EU pays almost $100 million per year to harvest a total of 250,000 tons of fish over 4 years. So if you do the math, you can see that the EU is paying a lot more for a lot less fish. And I think this reflects both Mauritania's desire to domesticize the fishery, make it their own by getting the investment rather than getting the investment in infrastructure and training and jobs, rather than just getting a payment like they get from the EU. That might be the reason why this Chinese agreement was put in place. If you're interested in this particular case, it's one of the access arrangements that's being profiled in a study that's about to come out from the World Bank called Scramble for Fish. As I was preparing this presentation, though, I decided to check in for the latest on this agreement because it was very controversial. A lot of NGOs were protesting it. And it seems that earlier this month it was canceled. And I thought, oh, wow, maybe someone's realized that there needs to be more assessment done on whether the fishery can support this kind of exploitation by the EU agreement layered on top of that, the new Chinese agreement. But actually, the cancellation has nothing to do with the stock. It seems that Mauritania is upset that China has only created 300 jobs so far. So my prediction is that this is a temporary blip, and they will work this out, and more jobs will be created, and the agreement will be back in force. The second case study involves the South Pacific albacore fishery, and as you can see from these graphs, in recent years, since 2008, the catch in the fishery has increased by about 20%. And that's a concern because a lot of the stocks in the South Pacific are moving toward a fully exploited or, in fact, potentially overexploited situation. So a lot of the increase in the albacore catch, which I should be clear and say is not overexploited at this point, has come from the increased fishing effort of China and to a certain extent Taiwan as well. But China's count or number of vessels of longliners in the Pacific has increased from 86 to 275, so it's tripled in the last 5 years. And these are not necessarily new longliners being built to target this fishery, but it's said that they're moving in from the Indian Ocean because of the piracy occurring off Somalia. They're moving out of the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific. So of major concern to the Pacific Island countries that are very eager to maintain and manage the albacore stock for their own benefit. It's in their EEZs, but it's also out on the high seas, and about a third of the catch is being taken on the high seas, where there are, of course, no access agreements and lesser controls for effort and catch. So in terms of looking ahead for China's distant water fishing industry, they have stated a policy. This policy was defined by consultation with industry, so probably reflects a very strong industry view, but they want to convert themselves from what they consider now is a large, big fishery to one that is powerful. Not just big, but powerful. So they want to increase their technology and increase their ability to catch more fish. The reasons for doing this, as they state them, are concern about food security, support for their huge aquaculture industry in the provision of feed fish to feed those farms. Not only jobs for people who work directly in the fishing industry, but also stimulation of other industries that support fishing, for example, shipbuilding, etc. And finally, as many of you will know, China can exert its sovereignty claims through exploitation of certain fishing areas. This is big in the news at the moment between China and Japan. So establishing a catch history in certain areas can benefit China in getting both territorial claims and also rights to fish in the future. So what we know about from the policy is that there is a plan to create 40 to 50 more trawlers and to send those to West Africa, the South Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. And the industry is calling for subsidies to be raised as high as 50%. Some research has already suggested that subsidies of the fisheries are as high as 20%. And China, I should say, is quick to point out that this is not all that high when you look at other countries. Whether that's true or not, I'm not qualified to say, but that's the Chinese perspective. And what is particularly of concern to me as a fisheries scientist is that there's little acknowledgement of the potential for overfishing and limits to the resource. There is an acknowledgement that there is increasing competition for the fish, but it almost makes it sound like if China could get there first, that they would catch them and there wouldn't be any issue with the stock being able to produce and be there next year when they go back for it. So how can we influence this industry to be more sustainable? Well, a lot of people think that the Chinese fishing industry is heavily government subsidized, and it probably is, but the government is, as far as I could tell, is only directly involved in the ownership of 30 to 50% of the fleet. So there are a lot of private companies out there operating like the Poly Hondon example I gave you in Mauritania, without at least overt government authority. So we need to develop a strategy that doesn't just premise our leverage on convincing the government to be more sustainable, but to also reach these companies as well. And I think one of the encouraging developments is that China is actively participating in regional fisheries management organizations, including the listing and removal from IUU lists of those agencies its own vessels. So they are taking steps to penalize their vessels that have violated international rules and to get those vessels off the IUU list. I think more broadly, as the Scramble for Fish study is looking at with the World Bank, there need to be better joint venture access agreements negotiated, and that means strengthening the capacity of the coastal states to put those controls in the access agreements in the first place, and then to back those up with good enforcement and monitoring. I have a question mark next to the last bullet point on public opinion, because while the many NGOs try to point out some of the bad actions of China on their websites and in the press, I am not convinced yet that China is sensitive to public opinion. So while there's nothing wrong with naming and shaming, I'm not sure that's the best way to influence China. So moving on to the second topic, which is China's fish processing industry. This graph comes from FAO data, and it shows the top 5 exporters of marine fish. These are either fish in whole form or fish that have been processed. And what you can see is, for most years, the top 2 countries are Peru, which has a lot of small pelagics that are most often used for fish meal for aquaculture, and also Norway, which we know is a very big fish producer. But China has grown, and those 2 countries have declined over this time frame, over the last 10 years. But China, if you see in the black line, has really increased, especially in the early part of the series. And that's not due to China's own production of fish, because, as I've said, the coastal areas are highly overfished at the moment. It's due to China's fish processing industry. Fish that are caught off Iceland or Greenland or the Barents Sea are shipped to China for processing and then sometimes shipped back here to Europe for sale in the supermarkets. So that's what's behind the rise of China here. The other 2 countries I'll just mention are Russia and Thailand. They've stayed pretty much flat during this period. Russia, of course, has massive fish resources, particularly in the form of the pollock fishery in the Pacific. It's the world's largest fishery behind the Peruvian anchoveta. And Thailand is, like China, a processing country. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of the fish that you can buy here in Sweden will have come from China. This is a graph from the European Processors Association called APSI, and they have documented that as much as 90% of the supply of whitefish and pangasius to the EU comes from imports, and the top importing country is China. So these are fish like pollock, as I mentioned, cod, haddock, hoki, saithe, and also yellowfin sole. The second bar there is Vietnam, and that's the pangasius. So that's a aquaculture species. So why would companies want to ship fish all the way from the Atlantic to China, process them and bring them back? Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. The labor costs have been low, although they are rising now. But the most important reason for setting up this industry was the very high yields that you can get from the fish with the Chinese processors. The seafood industry is quick to point out to me when I research this topic that their belief is that the best way you can respect the resource and to contribute to its sustainability is to make sure that you get the highest possible yield from each fish. And they feel that they do that by sending it to China. Also, China, as you know, is a major manufacturing center for all kinds of food as well as other products. So they have very good logistical connections. And if you're fish processing, you need to keep the product frozen and as cool as possible. So it makes sense to do it in a cold climate like China rather than in Thailand or Indonesia, other places where it's a lot warmer. On the other side, there are concerns about the food miles, i.e. the number of miles that you ship the product from the fishing ground to the processor and back. And also a concern that I've been looking at recently on behalf of WWF in what my colleague Gilles Hoche calls the great laundromat that could be China. We don't know whether that's actually the case, but anytime that you have large quantities of fish coming in, being processed and going out again, you have the potential for mixing legal and illegal fish into the same product. And you also have the issue of potentially mixing fish that has been certified to the Marine Stewardship Council standard with fish that has not been certified to that standard, and no one would be the wiser. When we talk about China's fish processing industry, we really need to keep in mind that it's not a uniform quantity. It's not a uniform entity. 60% of the exports come from the top 50 factories. And these factories are operating to a very high standard. They have very strict quality control procedures enforced by the big seafood companies here in Europe and the US that are buying from them. And they maintain, in fact, as I've found through inspections of the factories, very tight traceability standards. However, it's the other 40% that we need to worry about. That 40% of the exports are being supported by nearly 500 small workshops. This was back in 2008 that I did the compilation of the customs statistics shipment by shipment. So I was able to get these figures. Things have changed since then. There's been a lot more consolidation in the industry. And there are many in China that are looking to really tighten up the controls of these smaller workshops because that's where the problems are occurring. And those are some of the workshops that might be giving China a bad name. The purpose of this slide is just to not to tell you all the details of China's traceability procedures, but to illustrate that these procedures are set up on the basis of food safety concerns. And China, like any country that exports food products to the EU, has to maintain very high standards. And they do that through their China Inspection and Quarantine Bureau, which I'm very impressed with, I have to say. And the China Customs Administration maintains tight control of the fish processing industry because of the duties that are imposed on imported fish. Whereas if the fish is imported just for the purpose of processing, then there's no duty. So both of those agencies have a very strong interest in regulating the trade. As you may know, the EU has recently implemented a regulation to prohibit the import of IUU fish into the EU. And when I first started studying the system, it was a question that I was trying to address whether China would combine the EU IUU regulation tracking of the fish with what it has to do for food safety. It made a lot of sense to me that they would combine those two. And I think logically it does make sense. But what I was overlooking when posing that question is that the food safety regulations in the EU are controlled by DG Sanko, and the IUU regulation is controlled by DG Mare. So just like in the EU, when those two bureaus don't talk to each other very much, the same system is replicated in China and in many other countries around the world. China's Fisheries Administration does not talk to China Inspection and Quarantine. So what they did with the IUU regulation is set up a separate system, and they're not linked. And there's a problem with that. That is that the EU IUU regulation, I think, is not working effectively. And it's not because China is not implementing it properly. It's because there are actual loopholes and gaps in the EU IUU regulation, which could be remedied if the systems for food safety and IUU tracking were somehow linked. But They're not linked by the EU regulation, and they're not linked in the countries that are implementing that regulation. And those loopholes, I'll just preview them here. I'm doing a whole study on that at the moment. The 3 bullet points at the bottom. First of all, it's supposed to be a system to control and prohibit the catches of IUU fish, illegally caught fish. However, the certificates that go with the system are attached to the consignment at the point of export from the producing country. So by that time, the fishing vessel is long gone. Its logs and its records for checking have already left. They may not even be in the same port. So it's very difficult to exercise control and checking on fishing vessels when you delink the catch and the landing from the export. Secondly, and perhaps most egregiously, the catch certificates can be split and they can be photocopied. So just as an example, if you have a legal catch of 100 tons, you can split that catch and sell it to 2 different people. Each gets 50 tons, and each gets a copy of the catch certificate that says 100 tons on it. It's not easy, it's not difficult to imagine what kind of mischief you can get up to with that. And finally, as I mentioned, the tracking of the fish that goes into China through the factory and comes back out again is not, there's no tracking actually, because there is tracking from a food safety point of view, but there's no tracking of the catch certificate, and there's no linking of the catch certificate to that food safety system. So looking ahead for the fish processing industry, I think one of the things that is a big concern at the moment is that the Marine Stewardship Council labeled product is being mixed with other non-MSC products. So the Marine Stewardship Council will look to tighten its auditing and traceability protocols. There'll be less focus over time on IUU and more focus on this mixing of certified and non-certified product, I believe. As labor costs in China rise, there'll be more mechanization of the processing. So as I mentioned, the high yield that you can get from hand processing in China will probably diminish over time as more and more laborers are replaced with machines. However, from a traceability point of view, this might be a good thing, because a lot of the factories report to me that they can't maintain very detailed records because their personnel cannot use computers and they can't have computers on the line. If you have machinery on the line, you can automate some of the tracking that will inform the traceability. And finally, as I'll touch upon in the next section, which is about consumption, I think there'll be less and less processing for export and more processing for the domestic market. At the moment, we can leverage the fish processing industry in China to a great extent because we in the West are buying most of the product. However, those big retail buyers or big companies that are supplying our seafood also have an interest in keeping the system rolling. So the reason I say that is because when I'm doing my interviews with the industry and I'm asking about whether the EU IUU regulation is working, there are very few traders that will admit to me that there are any issues at all. Most of them say it's working just fine and everything's just great and there's no IUU anymore. So as the fish processing industry in China starts changing its orientation from a Western export-oriented industry to a domestic industry, I'm afraid some of the leverage that we do have now, perhaps that we don't use as much as we should, will diminish. And perhaps things like the Marine Stewardship Council will be replicated and made more to orient to the Chinese market as China develops its own labels and certification schemes. So finally, on fish consumption, and for those of you who don't recognize it, this is shark fin soup. If we look at total per capita consumption for China over the last couple decades, we can see that for China and for the world as a whole, everyone's eating more seafood. Global per capita consumption has doubled, but over that same time, China's per capita consumption has gone up 7-fold. So if we combine that with China's large population growth over this same period, we can easily see how great an influence China consumption patterns will have on the global resource. So what exactly are they eating? As I've mentioned several times, aquaculture is a huge part of China's production. There are many freshwater species that compose the majority of what's eaten by the Chinese public. But mollusks are an increasing part of the diet, and what we really need to focus on are these other species, because tastes are changing. Just as an example, the largest fishery in China is the hairtail, which maybe you've never heard of. Maybe some of you have. I hadn't heard of it when I first moved to Asia, but it's what's shown on the left of the slide, and to me it's not a very appetizing fish. It's not something that we eat here in the West, but things are changing, and a recent Rabobank study of Chinese seafood consumption suggested that salmon is the new Prada of the Chinese seafood market. There's also increasing demand for shellfish of many kinds. And I just spent the beginning of this month at many banquets in China, having a lot of shellfish, much more than I've ever had on previous trips in China. And finally, sea cucumber, because I know some of you work on sea cucumber, is a traditional luxury seafood product that's also increasing by 15% per year. So as you heard in the introduction, I've done a lot of work on the shark fin trade, but I'm going to be very disciplined today and limit myself to 2 slides on it. This is something very interesting that I found when I compared the Hong Kong trade data with the FAO capture production for sharks. So if you look at the black line, that's the Hong Kong imports. And now Hong Kong is not the only market for shark fin. Obviously, China is eating a lot of shark fin. But for many reasons, the Chinese import statistics are not reliable for this particular product. So we use Hong Kong imports as an indicator of the trend. And you can see those 2 lines are moving very closely in parallel, not at the same level, but when one's going up, the other one's going up generally, until you get to 2003. And then they both start going down. And what I am really interested to see is that final data point. Maybe you can see there's no gray data point for FAO in the final year because they haven't released the statistics yet. But what we're starting to see in the shark fin trade, at least, is that imports into Hong Kong are rising. And I'd be very surprised if the capture production is rising, because I believe what's behind the fall in both series of data since 2003 is that the shark fin market has reached its threshold of how much can be supplied. I just believe there aren't enough sharks out there anymore to keep fueling the demand that we have seen up until now. So with fewer sharks out there to be caught, obviously the imports are going to fall. So we'll wait and see what happens, but it would be very surprising to me if sharks can keep pace with the demand. Now, as some of you will know, there are many campaigns going on to discourage people from eating shark fin, and one of those that's particularly aimed at the Chinese public and has been somewhat effective is the one by WildAid using basketball player Yao Ming. And when I was in China earlier this month, I was asking a lot of people what the situation is with shark fin, and they were telling me things that I had actually read in the press too, that shark fin consumption in mainland China is decreasing because there may be, although I doubt it, people tell me this, but I somehow remain to be convinced that there are regulations prohibiting the import of shark fin to China. There are these campaigns that I mentioned, and also there's like a social backlash against eating shark fin. I always thought it was a very popular thing to be seen eating shark fin, but at least in the major cities, there may be now kind of an anti-bling factor, that you don't want to be seen doing something too conspicuously consumptive. You might be criticized for that. However, those are the factors that might be causing a decrease in consumption, but I actually believe that consumption is continuing to rise. And some reasons why I think that are that the Hong Kong imports are rising. The China import data is unreliable, so we can't really use that as a signal. The demand for other luxury seafood products is rising, so why wouldn't it be for shark fin? And I know from anecdotal information from fisheries managers around the Pacific that although there are finning regulations that prohibit the cutting off of the fin and the throwing away of the carcass of the shark, there are now, in response to those regulations, many more carcasses being brought in. So that suggests that the demand for the fin is still high and high enough to cause the fishermen to go to the extra trouble to bring the carcass into port, even if there's very little value in the carcass. So as I've kind of alluded to, shark fin is one of a suite of Chinese traditional luxury seafoods. The others are live reef fish, abalone, and sea cucumber. And many of these are depleted in many places around the world because of the previous and ongoing demand from China. So in some cases, the supply is now being farmed. For the 3 shown on the slide, you could farm these. For sharks, we still have to work on that. There's no option for farming sharks at the moment. But it's not clear whether these farmed supplies are actually going to supplement or kind of displace the demand for the wild stocks, so the wild stocks will be allowed to recover, or whether these farmed supplies are just actually feeding the market and maybe even increasing the demand. It's important to consider, though, that many consumers can tell the difference, or they'll ask the difference before they buy it between farmed and wild. And if it's not wild, they may not want it because they think that the wild is much better for them and a healthier product. So in terms of consumption, what can we look for? There'll be a continuing shift in demand for premium species, and this will mean the species that we eat in the Western markets will now be demanded by the Chinese as well. So I can see a scenario of price competition there. There might be less demand for luxury seafoods, but I'm really not sure about that. If the tastes change, will it mean that they replace the luxury seafoods that they used to eat with the new ones, or will they just eat more seafood of all kinds? There'll be continuing pressure on the resource, that's for sure. And there may be new labels and certification schemes created in response to consumer concerns in China about the quality of the products, or perhaps sustainability, probably more likely food safety. And in terms of how can we leverage Chinese consumption patterns to be more sustainable, I really had to scratch my head on this one because it's pretty difficult, other than the campaigns that are already being mounted by the environmental groups, to think about how we can change these patterns. Perhaps if there are additional international trade controls, for example, through CITES listing of sharks, or bluefin tuna perhaps, although that's not a particularly frequently consumed species in China, that might influence the consumption. And as I mentioned a moment ago, people's health concerns, either because they think a product is very good for them, they might want to buy more of it if they think it'll make them healthier, or if they think there are some contamination issues with that product. For example, there are some studies in Hong Kong that show high levels of heavy metals in shark fins, and that may, if those kinds of studies get more press attention, there might be less demand for those products. So for my summary slide, I was thinking I should probably say something that you expect me to say, because I've been saying it on all of the slides so far, and that is that I hope that this presentation will encourage you to think more about the role of China, and not think of China as having its own fisheries, because Chinese fisheries are now our fisheries as well. All boats are fishing right alongside each other in most major fisheries, and it's not that there's a separate Chinese market. More and more, the Chinese market is becoming the global market, and we're all competing for the same resource. But in terms of saying something that you might not expect me to say, is rather than bashing China and criticizing China, I really think we need to consider constructive means of engaging China, and to encourage China to think about some of the issues that hopefully I've encouraged you to think about today. So thanks very much for your attention. These are my contact details. If you'd like any of the references that I mentioned in the presentation, please let me know. Thank you very much.